Believe me when I say, 2021 me would be very embarrassed right now. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. Every year, thousands of people go missing in the wilds of America's national parks and forests. Most of them are found alive, thankfully, but over the years there have been many disappearances which left baffling mysteries that seem to defy explanation. Hikers round a bend in a trail and seem to vanish into thin air. Children are found miles away from where they were last seen. Bodies turn up in places that make no sense. Over the last 15 or so years, retired police detective turned author and filmmaker David Paulides has built a career documenting cases such as these for his Missing 411 series, in which he describes tales of unexplained disappearances from all across the United States and Canada. According to the author, these stories are connected both by geography and by a group of unique factors which prove that something strange, potentially even something supernatural, is behind these disappearances. But what if the truth behind Missing 411 isn't what Paulides claims? It's a question that I never set out to ask, but one that I found myself in the unexpected position of answering. If you're a more recent subscriber to our channel, then it may surprise you to learn that just 5 years ago, I was a Paulides devotee. I first came across his material through a cluster of Mr. Ballin videos on the topic, and my young and superstitious mind really couldn't get enough. I watched them all, and then when I ran out of YouTube videos, I went and watched both Missing 411 and its sequel, Missing 411 The Hunted. And it was clear to me that someone, or more likely something, was behind these disappearances. And I could tell that's what Paulides was trying to prove to the public. So, when I eventually started making YouTube videos a few months later, I made it my mission to show the world that something strange was going on in our national parks. To vindicate David Paulides. At first, I trusted David's word at face value. He was a detective after all. He knew how investigations worked. He said that he only included cases that hadn't been solved, and that this was a crucial piece of what made something a Missing 411 case in the first place. Foolishly assuming that his work was bulletproof, I felt that all I needed to do was provide even more evidence in favor of what he was saying. I would see comments claiming that his work left out details, or that things weren't as he made them seem, and I figured the people leaving them were simply too skeptical or closed-minded to see the big picture. It couldn't all be a coincidence, right? No, people just needed to understand how bizarre these stories were, and maybe that just meant that they needed more detail than Paulides had given them. And if they wouldn't trust his word, they at least had to trust the facts. Then, something strange began happening. There were disparities. Something wouldn't line up with the news reports, or there would be a detail that seemed questionable. And at first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone makes little mistakes here and there. It's not too big an issue if it doesn't pertain directly to the disappearance, and besides, with so many cases, it was impossible that there wasn't some kind of connection, right? And I continued to think that way for most of the first 2 years that this channel existed. And then I came to the case of Aaron Hedges. Or, to be more accurate, I came back to the case of Aaron Hedges, and largely because of those same skeptical comments I had been so quick to discount earlier. One user in particular, who goes by the name D. Richards, told me to look into the Missing Enigmas videos on these cases, which often cite direct case files, and finally I relented. I pulled up Nick's video on the Aaron Hedges case. Nick, the mind behind the channel The Missing Enigma, is an extremely meticulous researcher. And in the years since I first watched his video on Aaron's disappearance, I'm happy to say that he's become a friend of the channel. He's provided us with resources numerous times, appeared on our live show, and directly changed my mind about something on more than one occasion. It was because of him that I became aware that Paulides had left out a very important and extremely relevant detail in his coverage of the Aaron Hedges story. The missing person was actively going through alcohol withdrawal, was taking prescription benzodiazepines, and had likely been mixing the two in the hours before he vanished. I was floored. Not only did Nick have police reports confirming this to be the case, but those same reports noted that Aaron had been agitated and irritable towards friends and family. And as someone who's been prescribed those same drugs myself, and made similar poor decisions regarding their interactions with alcohol, I couldn't believe that someone could be unaware of how powerful they are and what they can do to the human psyche when in stressful situations. The only thing that made sense to me was that David Paulides must not have known that Aaron was an alcoholic or that he was taking benzos. And so I reached out to the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Department. Now, Sweetgrass County wasn't actually the lead investigative agency in the case. That role was held by neighboring Park County, but they were the agency willing to speak with Paulides on camera for The Hunted. A high-ranking representative for the county sheriff, who asked to remain anonymous, got back to me within 24 hours, and if my jaw was on the floor prior to that, it was in the basement by the time I finished reading the email. When I reached out, I specifically told my contact that one major point of contention in The Hunted is the omission of Mr. Hedges' alleged alcoholism and drug issues, which seem to have been included in some of the official documentation. Shortly after that, I received a response explaining that the department did tell David Paulides about the alcohol abuse and the suspicions by his friend of Aaron drinking, and that Dave chose to omit that from the final cut. And at that point, my entire perspective on Missing 411 changed. I could no longer honestly believe that David Paulides was simply making mistakes or that he was just lacking information. This was a cut and dry example of him leaving something out of a story because it would explain the otherwise inexplicable, the irrational behavior of the subject of that story. That said, I still wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, for some reason. He must have spent a lot of money on that movie, and while it's certainly dishonest, maybe this was just an error in judgment. Maybe he was choosing to risk a little bit of credibility if that meant people would turn their attention to all of the other strange stories, and in doing so, force the higher authorities like the FBI and the National Park Service to divulge whatever it was they might be hiding. But as I looked into more and more cases, that facade crumbled into dust. I still hesitated to call David Paulides a liar, even as examples of his dishonesty, or at least his failures to account for all of the information, piled higher and higher. Then came the Pennsylvania cluster, in which my concern for being respectful finally shattered. Pennsylvania is my home state, so I know this place well, and it soon became clear that David Paulides simply doesn't know anything about the Keystone State, nor did he try very hard to familiarize himself with the surprisingly vast and diverse landscapes that 13 million Americans call home. Over and over again, I found instances where Paulides would cite an article directly, only to then contradict something plainly written in that same article. Be it fabrication, misrepresentation, or omission, the author simply could not stop contradicting his own sources. By the time I finally finished the Pennsylvania cluster and moved on to the Yosemite cluster, home of the infamous Stacey Arras disappearance, I was done being charitable, and further investigation of America's oldest protected wilderness vindicated that change in demeanor almost immediately. David Paulides wasn't just ignorant or lazy in his coverage, he was actively being dishonest, and it became abundantly clear as the cases went on. At the beginning of this episode, I asked the question, what if the truth behind Missing 411 isn't what Paulides claims? And in this video, I will not only answer that, but I will provide concrete examples that prove David Paulides was never telling the truth about any of this, beginning with the story of how Missing 411 originated. But before we get into that, I have to tell you guys a secret. Despite my perfect hair and glowing complexion, you may be surprised to learn that I am not so great at eating my veggies. Now, I'm not making excuses, we all have our flaws. But as I gracefully age into my later years, I have found it necessary to supplement my diet with something that fills the gaps left by my failure to remember the existence of steamed broccoli. And that something is AG1. Truth is, I don't have the energy or iron stomach that I used to, but AG1's juicy green goodness is my way of boosting my energy, helping my digestion, and getting the immune support I so desperately need given how little I sleep. And if you're wondering why I'm not currently drinking it, it's because I forgot that we had to film this ad today and already drank my AG1. And that's why I can tell you that for a supplement, it tastes great, and it's convenient to be able to quickly shake it up while I make my breakfast and then take it with me to my desk. So if you're interested in seeing what it can do for you, now is the best time to give AG1 a try. You can get started with AG1 for less than $3 a day when you subscribe, so just head to the link in the description or scan the QR code to get your first order. You'll also get $76 worth of free extras, including 5 AG1 travel packs, a shaker, a bottle of vitamin D3 plus K2, and a metal canister filled with dreams and wonders. And speaking of wonder, you may be wondering how David Paulides came up with the idea of Missing 411 in the first place. Several years ago, I was visiting a national park in the United States and asking a series of questions to a law enforcement supervisor. It soon got around the park that I was making inquiries into specific topics that caused a great deal of conversation among the park's employees. These are the first two sentences of the introduction to Missing 411, Western United States. And if Paulides is to be believed, they are the background to the discussion which led him to begin investigating disappearances in the national parks for the first time. Paulides claims that he was back at his room at a lodge off the park property when an off-duty ranger in street clothing knocked at my door. Also, just seems like a good opportunity to say this. If you see 3 dots in quotes in the bottom corner of the video, bottom right corner, that indicates I'm reading a quote. We probably should have made that clear at some point in the past, but now you know. Anyway, Paulides goes on to say that the ranger introduced... Oh, look, there they are. The ranger introduced himself and stated that he had read my books and said that he knew of my law enforcement and investigative background and felt that I was the perfect individual to research an issue that he had known concerned him for many years. The issue, according to the author, was with regard to unsolved disappearances within the national parks, and specifically the claim that the Park Service was doing everything possible to keep a lid on the publicity surrounding the missing. Now, this wasn't the kind of thing that the average seasonal staffer would be aware of, just the upper echelon of law enforcement supervisors who were concerned with the numbers and certain facts surrounding specific cases. And it wasn't just limited to this one specific park. It was everywhere. According to Paulides, he left his email address with the ranger in case he ever wanted to forward along any information, but he never heard from that ranger again. Paulides also explained that he was purposely excluding the gender and park where the ranger was working in an effort to conceal the ranger's identity, which is an odd thing to say considering he identified the ranger using male pronouns numerous times throughout the passage. And with that, the groundwork for the mystery was laid. But there's a pretty major problem that we need to address right off the bat. Paulides can't keep that story straight. Western United States and its counterpart, Eastern United States, were published in 2012. Paulides published 2 follow-up books, North America and Beyond in 2013, and The Devil's in the Details in 2014, before bizarrely making the shift to covering smiley face killers cases, about which he also got a number of details wrong, in 2015's A Sobering Coincidence. I could say quite a bit about that, but the relevant issue is actually right there in the introduction, where Paulides writes, "My journey involving missing people started several years ago when I was investigating an issue in a national park in the United States and noticed 2 national park rangers following me." Now, that is a new detail, him being followed, and it is followed by a contradiction. I was interviewing contract workers about something and eventually got done early in the evening. Interesting. Because in Western United States, he explicitly said that he was speaking to a law enforcement supervisor. And that's not all. Later that evening, I heard a knock at the door, he continues, and 2 people were standing there. They stated that they were off-duty rangers and had a story they wanted to share. They knew who I was and felt that my investigative background would be beneficial in regard to what they were going to tell me. I invited them in. In Western United States, there was only 1 ranger. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but if I'm not mistaken, 2 and 1 are different numbers, right? I also want to make it clear that this seemingly minor disparity isn't irrelevant to the story. Paulides is very clear in A Sobering Coincidence that these 2 rangers only realized that the disappearances were a larger problem than they'd ever realized once they started working together at this specific park, and he made no mention of being followed the first time. Another difference relates to what Paulides said happened after his meeting. In Western United States, he claims that he drove home, made some calls, and then got on his computer to research cases. In that version, it was this bit of research which led him to conclude that something was off. In the Sobering Coincidence account, however, he got a call back from a law enforcement friend who told him he was onto something. Why omit that part from the original retelling of the story? There's also the change from speaking with 1 law enforcement supervisor to multiple contract workers. I was curious when the story changed, but I refused to pay $65 for a paperback copy of The Devil's in the Details, and North America and Beyond doesn't cover that part. What I did find was a 2013 AMA on the Above Top Secret website, for which Paulides supplied a biography. And that version described 2 rangers, and it also clarified that the conversation happened 4 years prior, so in 2009. You also may have noticed that in both versions of the story, Paulides was vague about what in particular he was talking with that law enforcement supervisor or those contract workers about when this happened, and that in the original account he mentioned that the ranger approached him because he was familiar with his books. Well, in 2009, Paulides had indeed published 2 books, The Hoopa Project, Bigfoot Encounters in California, and Tribal Bigfoot, and no other books. Those are the only 2 books he had published 2009 and before. So what does this mean? It means that this ranger, who was speaking to him in 2009, thought Paulides was the best man for the job because of his work on Bigfoot, which heavily implies that the ranger believed Bigfoot might be responsible for the disappearances. Now, the fact that this video isn't stopping right there is a testament to just how bad the situation actually is. And I do want to make it clear that I'm not intending to disparage Bigfoot investigators in any way. As much as I disagree with most of them, I've found that they're frequently some of the most friendly people out there, and that what they do is mostly harmless. Where I take issue with Paulides is his implication that America's favorite cryptid is responsible for completely explainable disappearances. It also bothers me that David, who in 2004 founded an organization called North America Bigfoot Search, routinely alludes to the idea of a large mammal absconding with people, only to turn around and pretend he's not doing it. And as for what I mean by that, I'd like to draw your attention to that AMA I mentioned, in which he said, "I am always asked, what is causing this? We don't know, and we have never made any innuendo about what may be occurring." And that is simply not the case. For example, let's look at the following entry from the Pennsylvania section of Eastern United States. This is another case in which the article did not give the first name of the child. The May 28, 1901 New York Times article merely stated that the missing girl was the daughter of Frank Simpson. The article states that the girl was playing with family members when she walked into the woods for some unknown reason. The children tried to lure her out, but she disappeared. The family summoned neighbors and friends to search the woods, but could not find the girl. I could not find any other articles about this incident, but there was one sentence in the article I found that was disturbing. "Is believed to have been carried off by a bear in the woods near here." There is no explanation as to why the family believes the child was taken by a bear. First of all, it took me approximately 5 minutes to find a decent number of articles from much more local sources which gave considerably more detail on this story, including the girl's first name, which was Daisy. I will give Paulides some slack because he was writing his books before newspapers.com or other similar websites were online, but that doesn't change the fact that he has a responsibility to either do the legwork required to get the full story, or leave it out if he can't. The more important part, however, is the last sentence of the segment. A common theme in Paulides' writing is the inclusion of bears in stories where there shouldn't be bears. The implication is that the witness or missing person, most often a child, encountered a large hairy mammal and described it as a bear because they didn't have the words to describe a Sasquatch. It happens over and over and over again throughout the books. In Daisy's case, Paulides failed to mention the part where numerous articles pointed out that a bear had been killing sheep in the area for weeks, hence the belief that she fell victim to a bear. These included a May 29th article in the Scranton Times, a May 30th one in the Harrisburg Telegraph, and at least one other from the same date in the Philadelphia Times. Remarkably, Daisy's case actually is bizarre in several ways, and yet Paulides left them out because he wanted to make it seem like Bigfoot did it. For more on that, see our second video on the Pennsylvania cluster. A similar error can be found in Paulides' coverage of the Great Smoky Mountains cluster in the story of 3-year-old Abe Ramsey back in 1919. We covered his story in detail in our series on that cluster, but the short version of Paulides' narrative is that the toddler vanished after he went off looking for the family's dog, Motley, who had bolted into the woods earlier that day and still hadn't returned home. Shortly thereafter, his mother went out and called for him, only to find Motley shivering in fear under the porch, while Abe was nowhere to be found. In addition, it appeared that Motley had been in a fight. According to Paulides, the entire neighborhood searched for Abe for several days, but ultimately found no trace of him, and thus nobody ever found out what happened to the child. And in his case summary, Paulides wrote the following: "I do find one aspect of this disappearance as being unusual and not consistent with the normal behavior of a family guard dog, and that was the behavior of Motley. I also find it unusual that the behavior of the dog and the other dog's barking coincided with Abe's disappearance. Big family dogs are not afraid of bears. Bears are afraid of dogs. This wasn't a bear that took on a group of dogs and caused Motley to run and hide under the house. Whatever caused Motley's injuries, and the disruption of the other dogs on the mountain, was probably somehow related to the disappearance of Abe. Now, the implication here is clearly that whatever hurt Motley and scared him back under the house was not a bear, but something else. We're going to ignore the questionable assertion that big family dogs are not afraid of bears and that bears are afraid of dogs, because what really matters is the fact that there was no dog in the first place. Motley is a completely fabricated character in this story, as is most of the narrative in and of itself. Not only that, but according to newspaper articles published on March 27th, 28th, and 31st of 1919, the body of Abraham Ramsey was found in a hollow log in a dense forest about 3 miles from his home. There was really no mystery as to what had happened, nor did Abe disappear in the way that Paulides described. The papers of the time were very clear that Abe's older siblings went to a nearby store, Abe tried to follow them, and they sent him back home. They also explicitly state that it appeared Abe had encountered a fork on the way home and taken the wrong side, which is how he ended up in the mountains. Another instance of the bear that wasn't a bear motif is present in arguably the most famous missing 411 case, that of Dennis Martin. Paulides refers back to the report of Harold Key regarding what he saw on the day Dennis disappeared. Mr. Key's son stated that he had heard and observed a bear, Paulides writes, which was later changed to his father saying that he saw a human. A bear normally walks on 4 feet, not 2. What was the difference in the sighting that changed the description? Now the problem is that Harold Key always said it was a man and not a bear. And he never said anything about seeing a man carrying something over his shoulder. It's not in the news, it's not in the National Park Service files, nor is it in the FBI files on the case, which Paulides claimed, along with others, were deliberately withheld from him, though they were later obtained by Michael Bouchard years after Paulides published his book. Instead, that entire narrative, which arguably forms the core of not just the Missing 411 narrative on Dennis Martin, but the Missing 411 narrative as a whole, derives from an interview which Paulides claims to have conducted with Dennis's father, Bill Martin. And I say claims because Bill Martin's wife told Michael Bouchard that the interview never happened. Or at the very least, that she did not recall it ever happening. And also, there's a lot of evidence that Dennis Martin's parents did not like talking about this. It's also important to note that Paulides has a habit of misrepresenting the words of people who even admit he did interview them, and we'll get to that later in the video. But anyway, according to Paulides, Bill Martin revealed that Mr. Key had told him things that were not in the papers. Convenient. Most importantly, that the Keys thought they saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline carrying something on his shoulder. Paulides continues, adding that upon further prompting, Martin again stated that the Keys had seen, the paper originally stated that the son thought they saw or heard a bear, and later reported the sighting as a dark-figured man running along a ridge, carrying something on his shoulder. And then Paulides goes on to say, the idea that a witness would mistake a hairy bear for a human doesn't make a lot of sense unless the human was very hairy, or they were wearing a shaggy, large coat. Now, while saying shaggy large instead of large shaggy does bother me, let's go over the last part really quickly. The idea that a witness would mistake a hairy bear for a man doesn't make a lot of sense unless the man was very hairy or they were wearing a shaggy large coat. Barring an outright accusation that it was Bigfoot, this is about as close as you can get to saying it was Bigfoot. Unless the human was very hairy is such a clear implication that it can't even be called, as Paulides put it during the AMA, an innuendo. It's damn near an affirmative claim that Key saw a Sasquatch. If you step back and look at the whole situation with some objectivity, it's very clear what's going on here. David Paulides is the founder and director of an organization called North America Bigfoot Search. David Paulides has written 2 books about Bigfoot. David Paulides' origin story for Missing 411 implicitly mentions these books as being the reason that the ranger or rangers approached him about these disappearances. David Paulides claims that the government has been withholding information about these cases from the public, and this information just so happens to imply that large hairy people were involved. David Paulides advertises his Missing 411 books and movies on the website for North America Bigfoot Search, which has not 1, but 2 entire pages dedicated to them. And finally, a review written by Coast to Coast AM host George Knapp, posted to one of those pages, reads in part, "People are vanishing without a trace from our national parks and forests, yet government agencies are saying nothing." From these facts, one can reasonably conclude that David Paulides is, at the very least, deliberately associating missing persons cases in and around national parks with a concerted effort by the government to cover up the reality, and apparently the danger, of Bigfoot. And while we're on the topic of Coast to Coast AM, I'd like to take a dive into an appearance Paulides made on host George Norrie's show earlier this very year, conveniently titled, "Can Anyone Explain These Mysterious Disappearances in Our Parks?" Back in January of 2025, new age media company Gaia TV released an interview with David Paulides, which I discovered on YouTube via Coast to Coast AM's Clips channel. And for those unfamiliar with Coast to Coast AM, I think it's fair to refer to it as the godfather of modern conspiracy theory and paranormal media programs like Ancient Aliens. Created by Art Bell in 1988, the program achieved popularity largely because of how different it was from most other shows in that space. As I said back in our Giants of Kandahar episode, rather than trying to convince the listener of the reality of supernatural phenomena, Coast to Coast provided a platform for enthusiasts, researchers, and others to call in and tell their stories without fear of mockery or derision from the host. In addition, because the aim of the show was simply entertainment, Bell was able to interview many guests who weren't arguing for a conspiracy theory, talking about being abducted, or telling stories about their steamy encounters with Bigfoot's daughter, or the later lawsuits resulting from her father's wrath. And honestly, the more I describe this, the more I feel like I'm talking about Joe Rogan's show as well. That's not a dig at Joe Rogan, it's just like I'm realizing how similar Joe Rogan's show is to Coast to Coast. The point is that Bell spoke with artists, comedians, actors, and even scientists, but the meat of his program, and what carried it forward after his semi-retirement in 2003, were the stories of the paranormal. Now, Paulides has been a frequent guest on Coast to Coast over the years, appearing no fewer than 36 times since his first interview in 2008. His early appearances were explicitly about Bigfoot, but in 2012 they began to center more on the missing 411 concept. It is on Coast to Coast, far from the mainstream audience for which David's books and movies are intended, that the lines between Bigfoot researcher and missing persons investigator seem to be most blurred with regard to how David talks about it. There's actually an episode from February of 2025, just a few months ago, in which the summary reads that David recounted a case in which two young brothers, after being lost for days, said they were hiding from the ape people, a possible reference to Bigfoot. As for the January 2025 video, I actually found it by accident as I was starting to put this episode together. I was curious where he'd go given a title like, "Can Anyone Explain These Mysterious Disappearances in Our Parks?" And I burst out laughing when the first one he mentioned was the case of Eloise Lindsay. We covered Eloise's story last year during our series on the Great Smokies Cluster, so I was rather surprised when he described her case as one of the more unusual stories along the Appalachian Trail in South Carolina, adding that she was in Table Rock State Park. Off the bat, Table Rock State Park is not along the Appalachian Trail, so that's not great. But the goal here really isn't to nitpick. The goal is to, as the video's title asks, explain these mysterious disappearances in our parks. In order to do that, though, we first have to understand what makes this case mysterious in the first place. Initially, I tried to rewrite David's account in a more linear way, mainly because I don't want to fault him for getting things a little mixed up while trying to speak from memory, but I think it's probably best to just quote him directly so I can't be accused of inaccurate paraphrasing or of changing his words from their original intent. Aiden, the David Paulides mood lighting. Thank you. I think she was in her early 20s, going to do a hike of 43 miles, and she was well prepared, lots of experience. She was going to be picked up, I think, 7 to 8 days after her drop-off point. Well, she wasn't there for the pickup point. Her story is that about 3 days into it, there were a series of men that were following her and harassing her on the trail. Now, when you take it at just that point, hey, maybe it's happened. This went on for days, and eventually, 14, 18 days, a hunter finds her cowering in the woods. Cowering. She's alive. Alive. They bring her out, and she tells this story that these men followed her, harassed her. She dumped her backpack, she got rid of everything, and then she eventually went to the hospital. The interesting part of the story to me isn't what she said, because she never explained exactly what she saw. But when her mom was interviewed, her mom said, "I'm not really sure what happened to my daughter in the woods, and I don't really know for sure what my daughter saw in the woods."
Like, she was not accepting the story of the men?
Or her daughter obviously wasn't comfortable in telling the whole story. But that scenario of the men along the Appalachian Trail, there's been many disappearances there over the years where people are just never found. Scary, right? Well, yes, but not for the reasons that Paulides is suggesting, nor did he include all of the relevant details. While it's true that Eloise was experienced and was discovered to be missing when she didn't show up, and that she said she left the trail because several men were following her and continued to follow her for the remainder of her time in the wild, Paulides placed undue emphasis on the words of her mother in order to suggest that Eloise saw something she couldn't or wouldn't explain. On top of that, in the Eloise Lindsay segment of the Missing 411 Eastern United States book, Paulides brought up a very misrepresented anecdote from Dwight McCarter, going so far as to say that while law enforcement seemed to doubt Eloise's story, McCarter seems to confirm that this event probably occurred, which makes sense when you understand that David's version of Bigfoot seems more akin to the version we've discussed in the past, that being Bigfoot as a tribe or tribes of near humans or even humans who live uncivilized lives out in the wild. Paulides' defense for this line of thinking is that McCarter claims there are wild men living in the mountains surrounding the park who have done illegal things in the past. McCarter specifically told us about a National Park Service ranger who was brutally attacked by one of these wild men who was never apprehended. You may be asking yourself why National Park Service and local enforcement do not acknowledge the existence of these wild men. If the National Park Service and sheriff deputies admit that the men exist, they must also admit that they cannot be controlled, monitored, or apprehended, as McCarter explained when we met with him. The problem with this passage is, as I said, that it is absurdly misrepresented. Paulides even explained in the Dennis Martin chapter to which he was referring that Dwight McCarter made it clear that the wild men he was speaking about were humans who decided to live in the wild, and that they had little contact with humanity, and they appeared, as the name implied, wild and unkempt. So to say that McCarter in any way confirmed Paulides' description of events here is patently dishonest. And I also feel inclined to mention that Paulides also wrote that this interview with McCarter was the first, last, and only time I have ever heard anyone mention wild men inside of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But I would invite any of you to speak with someone who lives in the immediate vicinity of Great Smoky Mountains National Park about this, because you'll find that they are well aware of the wild men McCarter was referring to, and that they very clearly understand them to be normal people who live in the woods. I actually had a long conversation about this with one of our viewers while we were in Alaska last summer, who lives, I think, in, Townsend, outside of Townsend, that area, who told me, yeah, the wild men are a thing, we know about them, they're just people who live in the woods. They're not tribes of these people, they're more like hermits. McCarter himself would eventually clarify, upon being interviewed by Michael Bouchard, that he in no way intended to suggest these were feral humans, but just that they were like hermits living off the grid inside of the park. But aside from the misrepresentation of McCarter's words and the attempt to frame Eloise's mother's statement as something implicating Bigfoot or wild men, Paulides' account simply doesn't hold up when you look at the totality of the reporting. Eloise herself told reporters that she left the trail after hearing a group of men behind her making vague statements about a woman walking fast up the hill ahead of them. I don't think it's at all impossible that this happened, as there were other hikers as well as construction workers in the area. It's the part where this is supposed to tie back to something like Bigfoot or wild men that's the issue. Once Eloise was safely back in the hospital, the Greenville News quoted her as she recounted how, in the weeks she believed she was being followed, the men chasing her had dogs, monitors for tracking down living animals, whistles, guns, tractors, cars, mopeds, and boats. That's not remotely descriptive of the type of situation Paulides was implying here, and her account actually led officials to believe that she was confusing searchers for stalkers. Given the intense logging and construction activity in the area in which she was lost, it makes sense that she would have heard the sounds of heavy machinery, and searchers do sometimes use whistles in order to communicate with each other and to help the missing person locate the people looking for them. Another thing Paulides emphasized, not in the interview but in the book, was how Eloise was in a somewhat dazed state when she was recovered. The state of being delirious or semi-conscious is a recurring fact among people who are found after being lost in the woods, Paulides writes, adding that there is something about this physical state that needs to be examined more carefully. I find it hard to believe that Paulides actually thinks this is strange, considering that he himself wrote in the same chapter that, after several days of being chased, Eloise says that she ditched her backpack and much of her supplies and left the trail in an attempt to lose the men. Though he did mention that she found a couple of pieces of pound cake and some stale donuts, likely left behind by a hunter as a lure for bears, he left out the part where all she had to eat besides that for 2 weeks was a packet of dried apples taken from her backpack before she dropped it in order to move faster. With that in mind, it's very obvious that she was dazed because she was in the woods for 2 weeks, and in that time, only ate dried apples and a few stale pastries. The Greenville News even quoted the physician who examined her, Dr. James R. Hanahan, as saying that he believed that she had enough calories from the little bit of food she grabbed out of her pack before she threw it down, and from the stale donuts and pound cake she found. This, he believed, was supplemented by body fat and liver glycogen, which he said are usually adequate to get you through an exposure situation. There is a simple reason why people who are found after being missing in the woods for days or weeks tend to be a little out of it. They're usually exhausted and starving, and Eloise was not just no exception, she was a prime example. All of that said, there are a few mysteries about Eloise's case, some of which do remain unsolved, so if you're interested in getting the full scope of the issue, then I'd recommend watching the episode we dedicated to her story from last summer. But as for the question, can anyone explain this disappearance? The answer is a very firm yes. To be fair, Eloise wasn't the only case Paulides mentioned in that interview with George Norrie. He also brought up the disappearances of Jared Atadero and Larry Dwayne Krebs, but I'm not familiar enough with those to go into detail about it right now. I do plan to get to them in later videos, but it feels like a good time to mention that this is the last time I intend to directly counter David Paulides in our content. A number of people have mentioned how it's gotten stale, and I agree with that sentiment. I have gotten a bit carried away, as I do, but I felt that if I was going to leave that aspect of our work behind, then I needed to put a capstone on it. And this isn't to say that I won't be covering any missing 411 cases anymore. I just won't be mentioning Paulides when I do it. Instead, they'll be more like our videos on the disappearances in the Bridgewater Triangle, the lost colony of Roanoke, Brandon Lawson, and so on. Before I put down the baseball bat for good, however, I want to explain how we got to the point where I felt this video was necessary, because it started with what is arguably Paulides' favorite cluster to talk about, and the most recent one we have covered: Yosemite. When I first started working on the Yosemite cluster, it was supposed to be a pretty long series, and one for which I was pretty excited. 34 cases of unsolved disappearances inside one of America's most beautiful, oldest protected wildernesses. 17 cases in relative isolation, and just as many divided into what I would refer to as subclusters in the Yosemite Valley and Tenaya Peak areas. Home to bizarre stories like that of Stacey Aris, one of the linchpin tales in the Missing 411 cinematic universe, this is the place where the conspiracy theory aspect of the phenomenon really took hold. If Paulides is to be believed, and to his credit there is a FOIA rejection letter out there, then the National Park Service actually did make some bizarre choices surrounding this place. It stood to reason that if there was any one cluster of truly inexplicable cases, it would be this one. Boy, was I disappointed to learn how wrong I was. The first Yosemite video quickly became 2, and as I celebrated the fact that I was finally a week ahead on script writing, a horrible realization dawned on me. Any further videos on this cluster were going to be extremely boring explanations of how utterly mundane these stories really were. It didn't help that less than a year ago, The Missing Enigma put out a fantastic comprehensive on the lone interesting one, the Stacey Aris case, which I feel I could at best match but not exceed in quality. And I very highly recommend taking a look at that video on his channel. As for the rest of them, I found there to be 3 possible classifications as to what happened. There were the cases with obvious explanations that are only bizarre if you leave things out, those that do seem a little weird but also have possible explanations, and those that are so obviously criminal that Paulides choosing to include them made my blood boil. That final category is what led me to go scorched earth in the manner I have with this episode, because his coverage of the Teresa Beer case was more than just negligent. If you haven't seen the Youth of Yosemite video from this past July 4th, then let me give you the basics. Paulides says that Teresa had permission to go Bigfoot hunting with a neighbor, that she went missing while they were near Shut-Eye Peak, and that when this neighbor reported her missing, he said she was abducted by a tribe of Bigfoot. I feel like it should be Big Feet, but that's not the problem. That's not the point. Paulides noted that suspicion fell on this neighbor, but charges were ultimately dropped due to what he implied was a lack of evidence. What Paulides left out was, well, it was everything. First of all, the case was not dropped because there was a lack of evidence to incriminate the neighbor, Russell Welch, for her abduction. They had him pinned in the most open and shut case of all time. How, you ask? Turns out he never had permission to take Teresa to the mountains, never reported her missing, his car and her belongings could both be confirmed to be in the area where she disappeared, and multiple witnesses were prepared to testify that they were together when she was last seen by someone other than Welch. What actually happened, according to the very same news articles Paulides cited in his story, was as follows. Russell Welch offered to drive Teresa, who Paulides failed to mention was intellectually disabled, to school on the morning she disappeared. He then convinced her that they were going Bigfoot hunting, as confirmed by numerous witnesses who spoke to her in town that day, and he took her into the mountains. Contrary to what Paulides said, Welch did not report her missing, and in fact, he didn't even tell anyone that he had come home from the mountains. Police eventually tracked him down at his mother's house 10 days after Teresa disappeared, and he only agreed to help them because they were going to arrest him for abduction if he didn't. He led them to a campsite where they found Teresa's belongings, and at that point told them that she'd been abducted by a tribe of Bigfoot. Why wasn't he convicted, you might ask? I mean, they had him dead to rights, didn't they? Teresa's belongings, witnesses, and his own confession that he'd taken her without permission had to be enough, right? They absolutely were, and he was charged for abduction. The only reason he never made it to trial was that the maximum penalty for an abduction was 4 years and a fine. And that didn't seem like enough for what everyone felt was at the very least a murder case, if not something more heinous. The problem there was that if they convicted him for the abduction, and a body later turned up, there were concerns that charging him for the murder would constitute double jeopardy, and thus prevent conviction for the more serious offense. I will not pretend that I understand how murder and kidnapping aren't separate crimes, but that's how the DA explained it, and a lawyer friend of mine confirmed that the argument might hold water. I presume it would probably depend on the judge, but the fact of the matter is that, as a self-described former detective who based his narrative off of the same articles I used, Paulides absolutely knows why Welch wasn't charged, and he decided to make it about Bigfoot anyway. This is a case where a man abducted and likely murdered or trafficked a disabled child, and Paulides all but told his readers it was Sasquatch. While that is potentially the most reprehensible example of the lies Paulides has told in order to sell his books, it's certainly not the only one. Other examples from Yosemite include Jan Hesselschwert, who disappeared while on a hike near Summit Meadow. Papers said that her body was found downstream from where he disappeared, at a time when reporting clearly stated the creeks were running at 8 to 10 feet above normal level. David leaves this out, but does include a detail mentioned in those same papers, that she was found in a place described as accessible only to climbers, in order to suggest that she was found somewhere strange. But she didn't disappear in an area only accessible to climbers. Streams overflowing with snowmelt, as reported by the same papers he cited, carried her there. Another case in this vein is that of Anthony Green Jr., who David Paulides claims called his family from a payphone near Happy Isle and then told him where he planned to hike before he went missing. According to the Fresno Bee, however, his family said they had no idea where he was going. And not long after he disappeared, Anthony's driver's license was found at the top of Nevada Falls, and shortly after that, his remains were found at the bottom of Nevada Falls. David said he never found any evidence that the bones were confirmed to be Anthony's, but that's because David Paulides didn't see the article on the July 21st issue of the Modesto Bee, which plainly states that the Park Service did identify the body as Anthony. Then we have the cases of Ruth Jacobus and Elizabeth Bartholomew, who were both older women who had wandered off before and didn't even go missing inside of the park. Bartholomew was confirmed to have Alzheimer's, and Jacobus probably suffered from some sort of dementia as well. Did Paulides mention the Alzheimer's diagnosis? Nope, and he didn't mention that she was a stroke victim either. The other end of the age spectrum isn't much better. As Paulides writes, I found 11 pages of articles on the Kenny Miller disappearance, and not one inquired about why the boy would be over 1,400 feet in elevation higher than where he went missing. He also found it odd that not one made mention of the lack of shoes, socks, etc. found on the boy, and that not one article mentioned that the boy's body was at one of the highest points in this area of the Sierras. But, as I noted in our video on the youth of Yosemite, the papers actually did address all of that, and Paulides acted as though Kenny's shoes weren't found right next to his body. Now, as I've worked on this, I've developed a classification system for these disappearances. Green is an easy explanation that should be apparent from the evidence. Essentially a story that simply does not belong in a book about unsolved cases. Orange is for cases that aren't plainly obvious, but may have a rational explanation, and typically this is how I classify cases that lack details or have just enough weird factor to not be considered mundane. Red covers things that are definitively explained by foul play, and then lastly there's the rarest of them all, purple. Purple cases are the scant few where I really can't comprehend what could have happened to someone, and I can really only think of one or two that meet that criteria. So why am I telling you this? And if you just saw the Yosemite videos, you're like, yeah, I know, you told me this already. Well, it's because looking at Yosemite alone, Paulides included at least 15 greens, cases with obvious explanations, in that cluster, and that's out of just 34 cases total. An additional 4 were in the red category, plainly instances of foul play, and I think that Nick from The Missing Enigma makes a strong argument that Stacey Aris constitutes a 5th. There were a couple of other cases similar to Kenny's that I put into my orange, maybe this is weird or criminal category, but that was largely because they were so similar to one another. But nothing about the specific 2 that I put in the orange category for that reason suggested the involvement of Bigfoot or wild men of any kind. Altogether, I listed 8 as orange, and of those, only 1 even approached purple territory. It was from the 1940s, and coverage was extremely limited. The most limited in coverage was a green case, that of Michael Feisery, and Paulides himself admitted that he couldn't really find any information on it. All there is a listing from the California Department of Justice, and it just says the guy was missing. Why include something if the only thing that puts it into a cluster is relative geographic proximity? Because this was at like the far north end of the cluster, not really anywhere near any of the other cases. And this isn't just a problem with the Yosemite cluster either. Paulides included a number of stories with clear explanations from all over the country. Evangeline Lorimer, for example, disappeared for a couple of weeks in the Smokies, only to show up right where she was last seen. She and her father, a traveling preacher with a history of diagnosed religious psychosis, called it a miracle of God, and then her father went on a speaking tour that he'd been trying to sell when she vanished. Mark Hansen vanished from the Appalachian Trail during a winter hike, and was later found in a drainage. Paulides made it out to be a mystery, when the documented reality was that he'd never hiked the AT before, was struggling to keep up, and reportedly gave up and decided to sleep on the trail. The reasonable conclusion is that he was cold and desperate, and he tried to follow the conventional wisdom of going downhill along a stream to reach civilization. The story of Jeff Haig seems to be a similar situation, though he vanished during the day while he was supposed to be waiting for another Boy Scout. As we learned in our Great Smokies series, Paulides left out a couple of major details, including the fact that Jeff was being bullied by the 2 other scouts along for the camping trip, and that the scout he was supposedly left behind to wait for was the scoutmaster's son, the same one who was the ringleader of the bullying. There was an orange, nearly purple case in the Smokies, that of Pauline Melton, but I won't give Paulides credit for that because he used an entirely unreliable source which didn't actually cite any of their own sources. You can't just state things as fact when your source is 2 random local folklorists who literally cite numerous internet websites in their bibliography. Just to be clear, I don't mean they listed numerous websites. I mean they wrote the phrase numerous internet websites in the bibliography, which is not a reasonable citation in any universe. The Smokies cluster also had a case of obvious murder and abduction of a child, Minnie Hahn, and much as with the Teresa Beer case, Paulides simply pretended that wasn't the case. There's a lot of the use of the word case there, but I'm not rewriting it on the fly. It wasn't as clear-cut as Teresa Beer, to be fair, but it was absolutely the most likely conclusion by a wide margin. It's bad enough to mislead people about cases where children sadly wandered off and didn't make it, but it's disgusting to do it with cases of children who were victims of terrible crimes. And speaking of children, let's talk about the Pennsylvania cluster really quickly, because it's one of the worst offenders in numerous ways. Of the 39 cases in that chapter, at least 14 of them are in the green category. One case was even explicitly a drowning issue, in which Paulides just acted like the papers didn't clearly say that the missing boys were last seen playing on the ice-covered Allegheny River, and that dogs led searchers to a hole in that ice. The deaths of John Dabkowski and Gabriel Minarson were a tragedy, but far from an unexplained one. The bigger issue with the Pennsylvania cluster, however, is just how dishonest it is to call it a cluster. In our first Yosemite video, I pointed out that the distance between the northernmost and southernmost cases is 112 miles, or about 180 kilometers, and that the distance between the easternmost and westernmost cases was around 125 miles, or 201 kilometers. For Pennsylvania, those same metrics are about 260 miles, or 418 kilometers, and around 332 miles, or 534 kilometers, respectively. There's just 5 more cases in Pennsylvania than in Yosemite, but across 6 times the area. David Paulides wrote that the whole state is a cluster, but if he'd ever actually been to Pennsylvania, he'd know that this is just an absurd statement. Not only that, but he also included cases in Ohio, Maryland, and New York. And that might be justifiable if any of them were close to a number of others within Pennsylvania, but none fit that criteria either. And while we're on the subject of criteria, let's shift to the final segment of this video, which is the ridiculous set of unique factors Paulides cooked up to connect his stories. Throughout the Yosemite cluster, Paulides made reference to people going missing near granite. Fields, outcroppings, spires, etc. Similarly, in the Pennsylvania cluster, he made note of swamps and briar patches. In the Great Smokies cluster, berries were all the rage. What do these things have in common? They're all mentioned as unique factors which connect the various disappearances covered in the Missing 411 books. According to Paulides' Introduction to Western United States, as you read the story behind each missing person, you will start to hear a consistent theme that includes facts found in other disappearances. The criteria I use to select specific cases for this book include a number of factors that are common amongst the disappearances. I'm realizing now as I read all of these quotes precisely how often he repeats himself. Anyway, these unique factors include the aforementioned 3 landscaping issues, as well as the inability of bloodhounds or other dogs to track people, dogs being present when people vanish, storms appearing soon after disappearances, rural settings, people going missing in the afternoon, people being found in areas that have already been searched, people missing clothing when found, and my personal favorite, the missing individual being found in a conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious state. So that gives us 11 unique factors to look at, and I'm going to start with the last one simply because it's funny. As we mentioned in our first Pennsylvania cluster video, that really runs the gamut of states of being. That's basically just saying that the person was found alive, and often the people aren't found alive, but they're still included, so that means they were found. Add that to the fact that there are plenty of cases in the book where people aren't found, and this unique factor is that the missing person, at some point, existed. Looks like we're down to 10 factors, 3 of which are simply features of the landscape. Paulides makes a big deal of people going missing near granite, and never really elaborates as to why that matters outside of individual clusters. The most relevant cluster to that factor is Yosemite, which happens to be in a section of mountain range that is literally 95% granite. If you're going to define a cluster by geographic proximity, and the geography is entirely granite, then that's not exactly a factor separate from the geography. And the same can be said about swamps and arguably also berries. I say arguably because I'm not sure precisely what berries have to do with anything. Paulides explains that the fact that berries and berry bushes play a common role in many disappearances is quite intriguing. People disappear and are found in the middle of berry bushes. They go missing while picking berries, and some are found while eating berries. The connection between some disappearances and berries cannot be denied. Thing is, it's rare that he actually mentions berries, and he doesn't do anything to explain how the berries are connected to the disappearances in any way that isn't incidental. Essentially, he turns a correlation into a causation for seemingly arbitrary reasons. The inverse is true of the storms issue, because a storm rolling in is likely to be a cause for someone remaining lost. Any search effort that has to contend with a storm is going to face more difficulties. A search that is more difficult is less likely to succeed than a search that, well, isn't. So the correct observation is that storms are associated with people remaining missing, not going missing. For that reason, a storm rolling in hours after someone disappears should be a disqualifying factor rather than a qualifying one. The afternoon disappearance part is also questionable. For one, that's just a common time for people to go hiking, and people who go missing while hiking are, by definition, more likely to disappear while hiking than while not hiking. In addition, much as with the storms factor, people who go missing later in the day are less likely to be found alive because there's less time to search before dark. The most dangerous time of day for a lone human to be out in the wild is the time when they can't see. Lots of people who go missing don't make it through their first night, especially if they're cold or wet. In addition to that, however, I'm not even sure that a majority of the cases in the book involve people going missing between the hours of 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock p.m., which is the window given by Paulides. He says that's the most common time frame, but a plurality doesn't feel like it's particularly important as compared to a majority. There are plenty of cases in the book where people disappeared early in the morning, at lunchtime, and in the evening. The only time period that's rare is overnight, and that's because it's when people are usually the least active. The rural settings profile point also makes little sense. If you're looking at rural settings, then obviously all of the disappearances will be in rural settings. Even then, Paulides frequently cites cases that occurred in population centers. In fact, he even included one that happened in Philadelphia, the nation's sixth largest city, in the Pennsylvania cluster. And that story didn't involve storms, granite, swamps, berry patches, or dogs. The only thing it had going for it was the bloodhounds not being able to track and the missing clothes, but it was also probably either foul play or a mental health crisis. Like, literally, one doctor blamed moon madness. That is the L.C. Flothmeyer case, and it's in the third Pennsylvania cluster video. Now, all of that said, bloodhounds are one of the few factors that actually are interesting, as can be removed clothes and people being found in areas that were already searched, though these aren't without issue either. In instances where storms haven't come through, and where we know where someone was last seen, bloodhounds not being able to track can definitely be a little strange. That said, I can't think of many disappearances fitting the criteria where dogs couldn't find anything at all. They tracked Eloise Lindsay a decent way into the forest before losing her scent, and they tracked Trenny Gibson to a road. Another important aspect about dogs is that they're simply not perfect. They make mistakes sometimes, and they can be unreliable for a litany of reasons. They're a good tool, but they're rarely 100% effective on their own. Looking at the clothes issue, I often find that Paulides doesn't seem to understand why people remove their clothes. He doesn't typically consider paradoxical undressing, and in the case of Richard McPherson, he questioned why the son of a forest ranger would take off soaking wet clothes instead of keeping them on. The simple answer is that wet clothes don't keep you warm, and can in fact speed up the onset of hypothermia. Most of the cases where clothes were removed seem to fit one of these paradigms, and I can't recall a situation where someone was found without their clothes in a place where they would have been warm and dry with them on, and where foul play also wasn't obvious. Children just also have a tendency to take their clothes off for inexplicable reasons in general, as anyone who has kids or grew up with siblings will know. Dogs being present at the time of the disappearance also sort of falls along the same lines as the removed clothes factor, in that when they are involved, which is rare, it's always for a rational reason. People don't seem to go missing more frequently when they're with their dogs, at least as far as the missing 411 cases I've read are concerned. And I've read a lot of them. I've read a lot of them. Finally, we have people being found in areas that were already searched, which in missing 411 terms typically happens in places with incredibly dense brush. I used to find this a bit more odd, but after going on the ground a few times, I see how it happens. Brush can be incredibly dense, and there are a lot of places where you could be a few feet from someone, and if they're not conscious, you'd never know it. Most of the cases where Paulides describes somebody being found in an area that was already searched are in places with dense undergrowth. And I can't think of any where the person was found alive, or at the very least responsive. Michael Reel is one example of a living child found somewhere that was already searched, but the number of searchers was limited, and he was on the move when they found him. He may have just not been there when they came by the first time. As we mentioned before, one of the few cases where the missing person was found in a place that was already searched, and where they absolutely should have been found earlier, was that of Daisy Simpson, and Paulides totally failed to mention that part of the story. All of this is to say that if you take a step back and look at the unique factors, it becomes clear that they don't actually make any sense. It would be different if he compiled a book full of cases where every single point in that criteria, or at least a majority of them, were met, but that's not the case with missing 411. Paulides rarely even mentions which unique factors apply to any given case, and there's precious few where more than one or two apply. On the other hand, while I haven't read Paulides' work on Bigfoot, something tells me that if I were to take a look inside his books on the subject, A lot of those sightings would involve granite, berry brushes, storms, and so on. And to be honest, I wouldn't have a problem with that. My problem with David Paulides is not that he believes in Bigfoot, or that he thinks Bigfoot might be responsible for some bizarre disappearances. My problem with David Paulides is that by reframing, misrepresenting, and even lying about these stories, he has built his career on the exploitation of both the subjects of his books and of his readers. And both groups of people deserve better. As I said, consider this my farewell to directly debunking David Paulides. I don't think I need to do it anymore. I think this video does that. I think we're there. And for those who said it was getting stale, this is my gift to you. I, of course, will not stop covering bizarre missing persons cases. I actually intend to do it probably just as much as I have in the past, but with cases that I genuinely look at and go, Or at the very least, cases that a majority of people seem to go, There's a limited number of these. They can't all be bangers. So if you would like to support us as we continue trying to explain the unexplainable, or at the very least, present the unexplainable in its most accurate form, then you can subscribe to us on Patreon for just $1 a month. You could shop for our merch at Bunker Branding, and you can get Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee blend that I designed myself with so much love and care. That's from Tableau Roasting Company. It's tablowroastingco.com. All this is in the description. If you're looking to get more Lodge, you can do that by checking out History Unhinged, the Weird Bible, which we're working on we're cooking. Don't worry, we're cooking on the Weird Bible. It's just currently in the prep stage. We're Julianning the Bible. And there's my personal channel, which I have not been able to stream on as frequently as I would like to recently, but you can still catch me and the lads playing some video games. I've been doing a little bit of reaction and commentary content here and there. You know, one day I'll have the time to do that. We also have our live show, which airs Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it doesn't, and if it doesn't, we're going to tell you that it won't be. And we will make those announcements here on YouTube, but the best way to keep up with what's going on is to join us on Discord, and you can do that by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge or clicking the Discord link in our description. And if you happen to miss the live show, but you still want the lads, you can get us lads here on YouTube as an on-demand, or you can head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever podcasting platform you prefer, and you will find us there. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.